Cowboy found Apache at the desert well, and his next question shattered their fate. Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let's return to our main character. Jack Thompson was no stranger to the harshness of the desert. As a cowboy, he had spent his entire life navigating the vast, unforgiving lands of the American West. The sun blazed down relentlessly, and the dry wind kicked up dust that swirled around him like the ghosts of old pioneers. But today, something was different. As Jack rode along the edge of a dried-up creek, he noticed a faint shape on the horizon. At first, he thought it was a mirage, the kind of trick the desert plays on the mind, but as he got closer, he realized it was real. A young woman, lying near a small, almost empty well, struggling to breathe. Her clothes were ragged, her skin covered in dirt and sweat, and she looked like she hadn't had a drink in days. Jack's heart sank as he rode up to her, dismounting quickly. She was Apache, her dark eyes wide with fear, her hair tangled and matted from the desert wind. Without hesitation, Jack knelt beside her, pulling his canteen from his saddlebag and gently offering her some water. She took it with trembling hands, her eyes still filled with distrust. He wasn't sure what had brought her here, but he knew he couldn't leave her like this. For a moment neither of them spoke, the only sound the wind rustling through the dry grass. Jack knew the desert was no place for the faint-hearted, and he could see that this girl, though strong, was near her breaking point. After a few moments, she managed to whisper, "Why are you helping me?" Jack paused, looking into her eyes. His answer was simple, though it carried the weight of a lifetime of struggle and survival in the wilderness. Because it's the right thing to do. He didn't expect her to trust him immediately. After all, he was a cowboy, and she was Apache, two worlds that didn't often meet with kindness. But there was something about the way she looked at him, as though she could see beyond the dust and the roughness of his clothes. Jack stood up and extended a hand to her, helping her to her feet. She hesitated but then took it, her grip surprisingly strong. As she stood, Jack noticed the fear in her eyes start to ease, replaced by a quiet curiosity. "I'm Jack," he said, giving her a small nod. She didn't answer right away, but Jack could see the conflict in her eyes. She was wary, but there was something else there too, something that made her seem familiar. She finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Nayeli." The name struck him like a bolt of lightning. For some reason, it felt important. He didn't know why, but he sensed it had meaning that could change everything. "You're not from around here," Jack said, studying her face. "What happened?" She looked down at the ground, not ready to answer. Jack wasn't about to press her. The desert had a way of forcing people to carry burdens they couldn't always share, but Jack had learned a long time ago that sometimes just being there was enough. As the wind picked up again, Jack turned back toward his horse. "Come on, I've got a cabin not far from here. You can rest, and we'll figure things out." Nayeli nodded, still cautious, but with a flicker of hope in her eyes. Jack didn't know it yet, but that small act of kindness, helping her, a stranger from a different world, would change the course of both their lives forever. And as they rode together into the setting sun, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. As Jack and Nayeli rode toward his cabin, the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the desert landscape. The dry, cracked earth stretched out in all directions, and the air was thick with the scent of sagebrush. Despite the desolation surrounding them, Jack felt a sense of peace as they moved together, the rhythmic sound of hooves on dirt a steady comfort. The silence between them was not uncomfortable, but rather filled with the unspoken understanding that sometimes words weren't necessary. Jack glanced over at Nayeli, who was still seated behind him, her grip firm on the saddle. She was strong, but there was a vulnerability to her that Jack couldn't ignore. He could feel the weight of the past she carried, though she hadn't spoken much of it. He didn't push her for answers, knowing all too well how hard it could be to share the past, especially when that past might be filled with pain and loss. The ride was long, but eventually, they reached the cabin, nestled against the edge of a small canyon. Jack dismounted first, offering his hand to Nayeli as she slid off the horse. She hesitated for a moment before taking it, her dark eyes meeting his with a mixture of gratitude and wariness. She seemed to relax, just a little, as she took in the small, weathered structure. The cabin was simple, with a stone chimney and a small porch that looked out over the canyon. It wasn't much, but it was home. Jack led her inside, where the warmth of the fire from the hearth greeted them. The cabin was modest, with a few pieces of furniture and shelves filled with the tools and supplies Jack had collected over the years. "It's not much, but it'll do for now," Jack said, his voice low. "You're welcome to stay as long as you need." Nayeli nodded but didn't speak. She seemed to be taking in everything, from the smell of the wood burning in the stove to the quiet stillness of the cabin. Jack busied himself with making tea, though his mind was still on her. She had said little since they'd arrived, and he wondered what was going through her mind. As he handed her a cup, their eyes met again. This time, she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "Thank you," she said, her accent thick but clear. "I didn't expect kindness." Jack frowned, unsure how to respond. "Well, I'm just doing what anyone would do," he said, trying to downplay the situation. But he could see the weight in her eyes, the suspicion, the fear. He realized then that it wasn't just about survival for her, it was about trust. She had been taught not to trust people like him, people from a world so different from her own. Jack sat down across from her, the silence between them growing as they both took sips from their cups. He had questions, of course, but he knew better than to rush things. In time, she would open up, and when she did, he would be there to listen. The fire crackled in the hearth, its warmth filling the room as the outside world seemed to fade away. For the first time in a long while, Jack felt a sense of purpose. He wasn't just surviving out here in the desert anymore. He was helping someone. And that simple act, he realized, had the power to change everything. But for now, they sat together in silence, two people from different worlds, brought together by fate, unsure of what the future held. Days passed in a slow, comfortable rhythm. Jack spent most of his time tending to his land, making sure the animals were well cared for, and the cabin remained standing against the harsh desert winds. Meanwhile, Nayeli, though still quiet, began to help around the cabin, whether it was fetching water from the well or gathering firewood. Jack noticed the shift in her, how her shoulders had relaxed, and how the tension that had once filled her every movement began to fade. She was learning to trust, little by little. It wasn't easy. Jack knew that much. He had seen enough of the world to understand that trust, once broken, was a hard thing to rebuild. And yet here she was, a young Apache girl in a strange land, relying on him. But Jack wasn't sure what had brought her to this point. Why had she ended up here in the first place? He decided it was time to ask. One evening, after they had finished their supper, Jack sat across from Nayeli by the fire. The crackling of the flames filled the air, and for a moment, he considered holding off on his questions. But then, he looked at her, her dark eyes staring into the fire, her hands folded in her lap, and he knew it was time. "Nayeli," he began, his voice low. "You don't have to tell me if you're not ready, but I've been wondering. What happened to you out there in the desert?" She didn't respond immediately, her gaze flickering to the fire, as though the flames held the answers she couldn't bring herself to speak aloud. Jack waited patiently, not pushing her, knowing this was a moment for her to decide whether to share or not. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke. "I was running," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack leaned forward slightly, his curiosity piqued. "Running from what?" She looked up at him then, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and resolve. "Running from a past that won't let me go." Jack's heart tightened at her words, but he didn't interrupt. Nayeli took a deep breath, collecting her thoughts before continuing. "My people, my tribe, they were betrayed. A treaty was broken, and many of us were taken, forced to leave our land. I was supposed to be part of a deal. A bargain to save my family. But I couldn't accept it. I couldn't live like that. Her words hung in the air like a heavy cloud. Jack could see the weight of her memories in her eyes. He couldn't fully understand the pain she must have felt, but he could feel it in the silence between them. I ran, she continued. I ran because I thought I could escape the choices others made for me. But the desert doesn't care about the past. It takes everything. Jack didn't know what to say. His world had always been simple: work the land, tend to the animals, and survive the elements. But Nayeli's world was different, complicated by history and promises that neither of them could change. You don't have to be alone anymore, Jack said, his voice steady. I know I'm just one man, but I'll help you. Whatever you need. She looked at him, a flicker of something in her eyes, hope, maybe, or perhaps just a glimmer of relief. She didn't speak right away, but she didn't need to. In that moment, Jack knew that they were both bound by something deeper than circumstance. They were connected, in ways neither of them fully understood, but it was enough. The fire crackled between them, its warmth spreading through the room, and for the first time since she had arrived, Nayeli seemed to relax, as if the burden of the world had been lifted, even if just for a little while. The days seemed to blur together as Jack and Nayeli settled into an uneasy but comforting routine. The weathered cabin became their shared sanctuary, and though they both came from vastly different worlds, there was a quiet understanding between them. The desert, with its harsh beauty and unforgiving landscape, had forged a bond that neither of them had expected. Jack continued with his work around the property, tending to the animals and repairing what needed fixing. Nayeli, though still reserved, began to open up more. She helped with small tasks, gathering wood, preparing meals, and cleaning, but it was clear she wasn't entirely comfortable. Jack didn't push her. He understood that trust was something that needed time to build. One afternoon, after a particularly long day of work, Jack found himself sitting on the porch, looking out over the wide, empty desert. The sun was low, casting a golden glow over the land. He felt a sense of peace that had eluded him for years. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was sharing his life with someone. Nayeli came outside, her figure outlined by the fading light. She stood next to him for a moment, gazing out at the horizon. Jack didn't say anything at first, knowing that she was still trying to find her place in this strange world. Finally she spoke, her voice soft but steady. I used to dream of something different, she said, her eyes distant. Before everything changed. Jack turned to look at her, sensing the weight in her words. What was it like? He asked. To dream of something different? She paused, as though trying to gather the right words. It was peace, she said slowly. It was a life where I didn't have to run. Where my people didn't have to hide. There was a quiet sadness in her voice, a longing for a life she'd lost, a life she couldn't return to. Jack felt a pang in his chest. He had never known the world she had known, but he could see it in her eyes, the memory of something beautiful, now lost to the harsh realities of the world they lived in. I wish I could have given you that life, Jack said quietly, his words full of sincerity. Nayeli turned to him then, her expression softer than it had been since the day they'd met. I don't know if it's possible anymore, she said. But you gave me something. You gave me a chance to stop running. Jack didn't know how to respond. The weight of her words lingered in the air between them, heavy with meaning. He had never intended to save anyone. He had simply done what felt right, what anyone would have done. But in that moment, he realized that the act of kindness he had shown her was more than just a simple gesture. It had changed something in both of them. Maybe that's enough, he said finally, his voice quiet but firm. Maybe it's enough for both of us. The wind picked up, swirling dust across the land, and for a brief moment, Jack and Nayeli stood there together, side by side, facing the uncertain future. The desert stretched out before them, vast and unyielding, but for the first time in a long while, it didn't seem so lonely. They had found something, Perhaps not a perfect life, but something real, something worth holding on to. And that was enough for now. The days turned into weeks, and the quiet routine of life continued. Jack worked the land, maintaining his farm and the small herd of cattle that had always been his responsibility. The desert's endless horizon became a backdrop for their shared existence, the isolation no longer a burden but a space for healing and understanding. Nayeli had found her place in this quiet world, slowly letting go of the fear that had once consumed her. She no longer looked over her shoulder at every sound or seemed lost in her thoughts. Jack saw it in the way she moved around the cabin, the way she helped with the animals, the way she began to laugh softly at the little things, as if she was finally settling into the life she had never thought possible. One evening, as they sat on the porch, the stars beginning to twinkle overhead, Jack turned to her. "How do you feel about staying here? For good, I mean?" It was a simple question, but it held a weight to it. Jack had learned that her past was never far from her thoughts, and the desert was a place that both healed and reminded. Nayeli took a deep breath, her eyes reflecting the vast sky above them. I think I could," she said slowly, as though the words were just now finding their way into her heart. "I don't know if I'm ready to forget everything, but I think I can learn to live without always running." Jack nodded, understanding the complexity of her feelings. "You don't have to forget anything," he said, his voice gentle. "But you don't have to run anymore either. You're safe here, Nayeli. I promise you that." She looked at him, a faint smile on her lips, though there was a flicker of something deeper in her eyes, a recognition of the quiet promise they had made to each other, that they would face whatever came next together. As the weeks turned into months, Nayeli grew stronger, not just in body but in spirit. The weight of her past had not vanished, but it no longer controlled her. And Jack? Jack found something he hadn't even known he was searching for, a companion, someone to share the quiet moments with, someone who understood the land and the solitude that came with it. Their bond had deepened, not through grand gestures or dramatic moments, but through the simple acts of caring for each other. The world outside their little cabin remained harsh and unpredictable, but for the first time in a long while, Jack felt like he had found something worth protecting. One morning, as the sun rose over the desert, painting the sky in shades of gold and orange, Jack stood outside the cabin, looking out at the land he had worked so hard to tame. He turned to see Nayeli standing in the doorway, her face lit by the early light. "It's a new day," he said, his voice soft, but filled with hope. Nayeli nodded, her eyes meeting his, and for a moment, the weight of the past seemed to lift, replaced by something else, something stronger, something that spoke of resilience, of new beginnings, and of the future they could build together. "Yes," she said, her voice steady. "It is." And together they stepped forward into the new day, ready for whatever it might bring. The days passed slowly but peacefully, each one blending into the next like the quiet, endless stretches of desert that surrounded Jack's small cabin. The rhythm of life was simple: wake up with the sun, tend to the animals, gather firewood, and sit by the fire in the evenings. In many ways, it was the life Jack had always known, yet it was different now. There was a new sense of purpose in his daily routine, a sense of connection that had been missing before. Nayeli, too, had become a steady presence in his life. She no longer seemed like a stranger in this place. Her quiet strength had begun to shine through, and Jack could see the change in her, the way she now moved with confidence, the way she would smile in the mornings as they worked together. It wasn't much, but it was enough. They were finding their place in the world, together. One afternoon, as Jack worked on repairing the old barn, Nayeli came to him with a bundle of wild herbs she had gathered from the nearby hills. The sun was high, casting long shadows across the land, and the heat was oppressive. She handed him the bundle, her dark eyes meeting his with an unspoken question. "These will help with the pain," she said softly, her voice steady and calm. Jack looked at the herbs in her hands, recognizing some of them from the time his father had spent teaching him about the land. "You know the land well," he said, a hint of admiration in his voice. Nayeli nodded, though she didn't speak. There was still so much of her past that she kept to herself, but Jack understood. She had been through more than anyone should have to bear, and there was no rush to force her to open up. I learned from my grandmother, Nayeli said after a moment, her voice almost a whisper. She was a healer. She taught me how to use the plants, how to listen to the land. Jack's heart tightened at her words. He had known that she carried something heavy inside her, but he hadn't realized just how deep her connection to her past ran. She must have been a strong woman, he said, his voice filled with respect. Nayeli's gaze shifted to the horizon, and for a moment, Jack thought she might say more. But then she shook her head gently, as though pushing away the memories. She was, she said quietly. But she's gone now. Jack didn't push her further. Instead, he simply took the herbs from her and began to work, knowing that sometimes silence spoke more than words ever could. As the days went on, Jack and Nayeli continued to settle into their shared life. They didn't speak much about the past, but it hung in the air between them, unspoken yet always present. Jack knew there was a lot Nayeli had yet to share, and in time, he hoped she would. For now, though, they were building something new, a life together in the desert, where the land was harsh but beautiful, and the silence was not a void but a space for healing. One evening, as the sun set behind the distant mountains, Jack stood outside, looking at the changing colors of the sky. He felt a sense of peace, something he hadn't felt in years. And when Nayeli came to stand beside him, her presence felt like a promise. A promise that no matter what the future held, they would face it together, side by side. It's beautiful, isn't it? Nayeli said, her voice soft and steady. Jack smiled, looking at the horizon with a quiet appreciation for the moment. It is, he replied, his voice full of a peace he hadn't expected to find. They stood there for a long time, watching the sunset, knowing that this was just the beginning of something new. A new chapter. A new life. The morning light streamed through the cabin's small windows, casting long shadows across the floor. The world outside was still, as it always was at dawn. Jack stood by the stove, stirring a pot of coffee, the aroma filling the room. He was beginning to get used to the quiet, the way life felt different now that Nayeli had become a part of it. But as much as he had adapted to her presence, there was still the question of the future hanging over them. The desert was unpredictable, and Jack knew it was only a matter of time before something would challenge the peaceful existence they had built. Nayeli came into the kitchen, her movements quiet and graceful. She had become a constant presence in his life, though she still kept her distance from him in some ways. Jack had never pressed her to speak more about her past. He knew that in time, when she was ready, she would share what she needed to. For now, they worked side by side, and that was enough. What's on your mind? Nayeli's voice broke through his thoughts, soft yet steady. Jack looked up, a bit surprised to find her so close. Just thinking about what comes next, he said, his voice more thoughtful than he had intended. The desert has a way of changing things. I guess I'm wondering what it has in store for us. She nodded slowly, as though she understood. The land will always be here, she said, her eyes meeting his. It will give what it can, and take what it must. Jack couldn't help but feel a little comforted by her words. The desert had a way of doing that, reminding him of its vastness, its power, and yet, its ability to sustain life if one respected it. I suppose that's true, Jack said, his voice quieter now. It's just that sometimes, it feels like we're waiting for something to happen. Nayeli's gaze softened, and she stepped closer, taking a seat at the small table by the window. We are always waiting, she said simply. But we can't control when things change. We can only prepare for it. Her words resonated with Jack more than he expected. In all his years out here, he had learned that survival wasn't about controlling everything. It was about adapting to whatever came. The desert had its rules, its rhythms. And the key was to find peace within those rhythms, to let the world move around him without always feeling the need to fight it. Jack sat down across from Nayeli, his mind still racing, but now, there was a calmness to his thoughts. I never thought I'd end up here, he said quietly, almost to himself. Not like this. Not with someone else. Nayeli gave him a small smile, her eyes filled with something like understanding. Sometimes the things we never expect are the things we need most. Jack looked at her, his chest tightening with the realization that, despite everything, she was right. He hadn't expected this life, this partnership, this quiet companionship, but it had become something he cherished. And for the first time in a long while, Jack wasn't afraid of what the future might bring. He knew they would face it together, just as they had faced everything else. "You're right," he said, his voice steady. "We don't know what's ahead, but we'll figure it out." Nayeli's gaze lingered on him for a moment longer before she nodded, her lips curling into a soft, quiet smile. The moment hung between them, not heavy, but full of unspoken promise. And in that moment, as the sun rose higher in the sky, Jack realized that no matter what the desert or the world outside might throw their way, they had each other. And that was enough. As the weeks passed, the land around Jack's cabin seemed to transform. The heat of summer began to wane, giving way to the crisp air of autumn. The desert, though still harsh, felt a little less lonely. Jack found himself waking up each morning with a sense of anticipation, not for work or survival, but for the simple act of sharing the day with Nayeli. The two of them worked side by side, with an unspoken understanding between them that neither had to put into words. One morning, as Jack went about his usual chores, he noticed something strange. A lone rider was approaching from the horizon, kicking up dust as his horse galloped steadily toward the cabin. Jack's first instinct was to reach for his rifle, but something stopped him. It was the way the rider moved, the rhythm of his horse, that suggested he wasn't an enemy. Nayeli, who had been tending to the garden, also noticed the rider. Her face stiffened for just a moment, then softened. She walked over to Jack, standing beside him as the man drew closer. "Do you know him?" Jack asked, his hand still resting on the rifle. Nayeli shook her head slowly, her eyes narrowing slightly as she tried to make out the rider's face. "I don't know," she replied quietly, her voice tinged with uncertainty. The rider pulled up to the cabin, his horse slowing to a stop. He dismounted gracefully and looked at Jack, his eyes scanning the scene. Jack stood firm, watching him closely, unsure of what to expect. The rider was tall, with dark hair and a weathered face that spoke of years spent on the move. He wore a long coat, faded from use, and boots covered in dust. "I'm looking for a place to rest for a while," the man said, his voice deep but calm. "I've been traveling for days." Jack didn't lower the rifle but gave the man a hard look. "We don't have much to offer here. Just a small cabin and a couple of acres." The man nodded, not deterred by the cold reception. "I understand. I'm not asking for much, just a roof over my head for the night. I'll leave at first light." Jack studied him for a moment longer, then glanced over at Nayeli. She gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod, and Jack knew that she trusted this man for reasons that she didn't need to explain. "All right," Jack said, lowering his rifle slightly but not putting it away. "You can stay for the night. But no funny business." The rider smiled, a glimmer of appreciation in his eyes. "Thank you. I won't be any trouble." As the man settled his horse by the small stable Jack had built, the two of them went inside. The fire was still warm from breakfast, and Jack didn't mind sharing a meal with a traveler, though he remained cautious. Nayeli, who had been silent since the rider's arrival, went to prepare a pot of stew. Jack watched her for a moment, noticing how natural it seemed for her to move about the cabin. He had never imagined a life like this, not when he had been alone, but now it felt right. The stranger remained quiet as they sat down to eat, and Jack found himself wondering about his past. Who was he? What was he running from, just like Nayeli had been? As the man ate, Jack realized that the questions he had were probably irrelevant. People came and went in this land, and sometimes, all you could do was offer them kindness. "Where are you headed?" Jack asked, his voice casual but with an edge of curiosity. The man paused, his gaze lifting from his plate. "North," he said simply. "There's a town up that way. I've heard there's work for those who want it." Jack nodded, not pressing further. He didn't care about the details, not really. But he couldn't help feeling a sense of unease, the kind that came with the unknown. The rest of the evening passed in silence, save for the crackling of the fire. Jack and Nayeli worked together to clean up, and when it was time for bed, the stranger settled on the cot in the corner. Jack lay awake for a long time, staring up at the ceiling. The desert was full of secrets, and Jack knew that, just like the wind, they would always be blowing in from some distant place, leaving stories behind. And for now, he was part of one of those stories, with Nayeli by his side, waiting for the next chapter to unfold. The next morning, the sun rose over the desert, casting its golden light on the quiet land. Jack woke to the sound of birds singing, the air cool against his skin. He stretched, feeling the familiar ache of his muscles, the result of hard work and long days under the sun. As he stepped outside, he was greeted by the sight of the stranger already saddling his horse. Jack watched for a moment, unsure if he should say something or let the man leave quietly. Nayeli emerged from the cabin behind him, her eyes still soft with sleep but focused as she took in the scene. "Is he leaving?" she asked, her voice still heavy with the remnants of dreams. "Looks like it," Jack replied, his tone neutral. The stranger noticed them watching and gave them a nod, his face unreadable. He finished securing the saddle, then turned to Jack. "I appreciate your hospitality," he said, his voice calm, but there was a hardness to it, as if he were a man who had learned not to show too much emotion. Jack nodded in return, unsure how to respond. "Take care of yourself out there," he said finally, his voice steady. The man didn't say anything more, just mounted his horse and rode off toward the north, the dust rising behind him as he disappeared into the horizon. Nayeli stood beside Jack, both of them watching until the man was no longer visible. There was a strange feeling in the air, an unsettled kind of quiet that seemed to linger long after the rider had gone. Jack looked at Nayeli, his brow furrowed. "Do you think he was telling the truth?" Nayeli didn't answer immediately. She seemed to be weighing something in her mind, her eyes scanning the empty desert as if searching for answers in the silent land. "He was a traveler," she said finally. "But sometimes people who wander are looking for something more than just a place to stay." Jack nodded, his thoughts drifting to the stranger's words. The man had spoken of a town to the north, a place where work might be found. It didn't seem like much, but it was enough to stir something inside Jack. He had never been one to seek out adventure, preferring the steady rhythm of life on his land. But the thought of something more, something beyond the horizon, lingered in the back of his mind. "Maybe," he said slowly, "maybe it's time we see what's out there." Nayeli turned to him, her expression unreadable. "What do you mean?" Jack hesitated for a moment, then sighed. "I've been here a long time. And while I've built something good with this land, there's more out there, isn't there? A whole world we don't know about." Nayeli didn't speak, but her eyes softened. She understood, even if she didn't fully agree. Jack knew it wouldn't be easy, leaving behind the life they had made together. The desert had a way of getting under your skin, making you feel like you were part of it, that it was a place where you could survive as long as you respected it. But there were other places, other lives, waiting to be explored. "Maybe it's time we move forward," Jack said quietly, the decision slowly solidifying in his mind. "Together." Nayeli's gaze met his, and for a moment either of them spoke. Then, finally, she nodded. "Together." And just like that, something shifted. It wasn't a grand moment, or a loud declaration, but there was a sense of certainty between them. The road ahead was uncertain, full of unknowns, but they would face it together, side by side, just as they had with everything else. And for the first time in a long time, Jack felt a sense of hope, a feeling that whatever came next, they would be ready. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, they turned back to the cabin, ready to prepare for the journey that awaited them. The desert, though vast and unforgiving, no longer felt like an obstacle. It felt like a beginning, a place that had given them the strength to move forward into the unknown.